Gen Z's The One Who Shall Not Be Named is clearly Vecna. Because not for a single moment has Netflix's Stranger Things tried to paint its noseless villain in a sympathetic note. However, the West End and Broadway had a very different plan, as it not only gave us an origin story for Vecna, but also chose to turn the tables by giving Henry Creel the whole misunderstood villain arc. To top that off, the Duffer Brothers have specifically mentioned the stage play to be a part of Netflix's canon. After watching the first 4 episodes of the new season, it seems like we're back to the old chicken and egg debate, as the Netflix series is gearing up for the big finale. Back in Season 4, Dustin had dubbed Vecna as the Mind Flayer's 5-star general. Despite that, the villain was presented to be the one who kept the shadowy entity on a leash. However, given the trajectory of the first shadow, it seems like Vecna might just be a pawn in the grander scheme of things, in the Upside Down. To be honest, it can't be an easily dismissed theory, because given the amount of Easter eggs hidden in the first volume to nod to the play, it just seems too dumb to ignore. However, this means the ending will not only see the gang facing Vecna, but also the Mind Flayer. Vecna's status as a pawn to some other darker and bigger evil, such as the Mind Flayer or the Upside Down itself, would also significantly increase the danger threshold for the final installment of the show. Having said that, let's discuss why we're so firmly rooting for the Mind Flayer to be the master of puppets in Stranger Things. Let's begin.
He was scared. More than scared, he was terrified.
If it were not for the Mind Flayer, Henry Creel would be just a normal kid. Set in the year 1959, when the party's parents were high school kids, Stranger Things, the first shadow takes us back to when the Creel family first moved to Hawkins, where Henry began committing his horrific crime that led him to Dr. Martin Brenner. The play starts with a flashback to 1943, when the United States conducted a secret experiment with the USS Elder, hoping to use a force field to turn the ship invisible and undetectable to the Germans during World War II. However, the ship was unfortunately transported to Dimension X, where most of the crew were killed by strange humanoid creatures, aka Demogorgon. Now, the crew was led by a Captain Brenner, who was Dr. Brenner's father, and also the only one to make it out alive of this horrifying realm and return back to the real world. Of course, such an altercation had dire consequences, as the captain was not just fatally injured, but also had a strange, unidentified blood type. He eventually succumbed to his injury, but not before telling his son about this mysterious new place called Dimension X. From that very moment, it became Martin Brenner's personal mission to go back to the strange place that was directly responsible for the death of his father and uncover what really happened. He eventually used government funds to found the Nevada experiment, and was even successful because his team actually did end up creating all the necessary equipment that was needed to open a gate to Dimension X once again. However, one of the men in his team turned out to be an undercover Soviet spy who ended up stealing this tech before it could even be activated, and eventually hid it inside a cave system near the laboratory in Nevada. Now, during this period, the Creel family was living in the small town of Rachel, which was not very far from those caves. One day, when an 8-year-old Henry Creel was exploring and playing with a spyglass, he perchance stumbled inside the cave near the military base and got lost in the process. He was eventually found 12 hours later, outside the cave without having any memory of what exactly happened to him. Of course, people didn't know that Henry ended up finding Brenner's stolen device hidden inside the cave and accidentally activated the equipment, which ended up zapping him into Dimension X for the very first time in his life. That is how he faced the Mind Flayer for the first time and got flayed in the process. This basically proves that since that day, the shadowy entity has been haunting him because it was indeed the Mind Flayer that had corrupted him and potentially gave him psychic power. Sure, he did come back home, but after those 12 hours, Henry was forever changed. Not just his personality, his blood type had also changed, almost making him a completely different person. And you can tell that this dude was terrified of the Mind Flayer because of that scene with Max in episode 3, when Henry simply froze up outside the cave that she hid in, looking almost like he had his ass handed over to him. Because that was him living through his childhood trauma once again, because the cave system started it all. In the play, Henry dropped his spyglass inside the cave, and that helped Brenner track him down years later, even after his family moved to Hawkins, where they started living in what we know as the Creel house. The Creel house. The Mind Flayer's influence on him didn't fade. Rather, he began wrestling with disturbing thoughts and struggling with the secret burden of his strange, psychokinetic powers. One fine day, when Henry's alone in the attic, something dark begins to take hold and feels his mind slip into a place he calls the battlefield, which is basically a twisted mental space where he loses control of himself before he even understands what was happening to him. Harry ends up killing several animals in Hawkins. Later, Henry becomes tormented by visions of a terrifying humanoid creature, and the fear eats at him, especially the thought that this darkness inside him might one day push him to hurt the love of his life, Patty Newby. Unfortunately, this monster appears again, but this time the haunting was much stronger than before, and in the process, Henry loses his grip on himself, blinding Patty's dad in the process. But when Mr. Newby finally wakes up in the hospital, he tells Patty that Henry actually saved him from the monster and even sketches the shadowy creature he had seen. Now the sketch that he puts on paper is unmistakable because it was the Mind Flayer. During the same time, Henry's mother, Virginia Creel, decides that she can't handle her son anymore, and as a result, she brings Henry to Dr. Martin Brenner for help. It is then revealed that she has been taking drugs supplied by Brenner, and these drugs made her vulnerable enough to share everything about Henry with. Anyway, the boy then has a very intense session with Brenner, who almost forces Henry to kill a man, but the latter refuses to do so. Eventually, after Henry returns home, he immediately senses that his family's happiness was not what it seemed, and so he reaches into his mother's mind, only to discover that she planned to send him back to Brenner and realized what his parents really felt about him. Feeling betrayed and vulnerable, Henry finally gives into the shadowy entity a la the Mind Flayer that has been pulling at him ever since Dimension X, and so he ends up killing both his mother, Virginia, and his sister, Alice. After Virginia and Alice's deaths, the blame falls unfairly on Victor Creel. Meanwhile, Henry makes his way to Hawkins High to protect Patty from Brenner, who wants to kill her because she was the only reason why Henry could not reach his full potential. But before they can really talk, Brenner shows up to taunt Henry, insisting Patty is his weakness. But Patty pleads with Henry not to play heed to. Sadly, the boy was already fighting to keep control over himself and the darkness inside him. As he keeps struggling, the fear and the pressure become too much for him to handle, and as a result, the Mind Flayer takes control over Henry again. In a horrifying moment, Henry loses the fight and throws Patty off, while she survives. Patty is rushed to the hospital for being badly injured. Meanwhile, Brenner takes Henry back to Hawkins' lab, where he becomes 001. In a way, Brenner also pushed Henry over the edge to embrace the Mind Flayer's influence, and ever since then, it's assumed that Henry Creel has simply been doing the entity's bidding. If you remember Stranger Things Season 4, led us to believe that Henry was always a troubled and disturbed child who was born with psychic power. However, now we know how that is far from being the truth. Furthermore, the Netflix series suggested that the first time he ever traveled to the Upside Down was as an adult, when Eleven used her powers to imprison him there, after she temporarily opened a gate to banish him. But this was also a misdirection to keep us from figuring out the truth. I think after he was trapped in Dimension, Henry became Vecna, as the Mind Flayer's 5-star general. Now people usually get confused that Vecna created the Mind Flayer, but the Mind Flayer actually existed as a formless, chaotic entity in the Dimension X before Vecna found it. Vecna simply used the powers that he channeled through this shadowy entity to give the chaotic, formless mass of swirling particles a physical form, thus shaping it into the spider-like creature as seen in the show. This basically established a connection where Vecna became powerful enough that he could command it. However, the Mind Flayer existed way before Vecna, but as a being of pure chaos without a true form or mind, meaning it was Vecna who gave it structure. In that, Vecna is theorized to be the commander of the Mind Flayer's powerful hive-linked arm. Compared to the Netflix show, the first Shadow stage play really tells a different story, as it basically suggests how the Mind Flayer already existed in Dimension X, long before Vecna ever came along. So naturally, it seems like the Mind Flayer is the true ultimate threat. If it created Vecna instead of the other way around, then the creature is far more powerful and far more important than we originally thought. I mean, that really makes sense, because he was never always evil. Henry was just a kid before his accident in Dimension X, and the Mind Flayer's grip on his mind was never his choice. The best way to understand this would be to take Billy Hargrove's case from Season 3 of Stranger Things, because when the party realized that he was the Mind Flayer's new hope and was leading an army to essentially recreate a monstrous version of the entity in the real world, Billy himself admits how he has been doing things. He doesn't want to because he asked him to. Billy was terrified of the Mind Flayer, up until when he decided to put up one last fight against the entity and sacrificed himself to save the other. In a similar way, Henry did his best to resist the Mind Flayer's influence until it became too much for him to handle, and so he had to give in to the darkness. That's exactly why I think Henry aka Vecna, has always been a pawn in the Mind Flayer's grand plan to take over the world and reshape it in its own vision, because this is literally what the shadowy entity has been trying to do since Season 1. The theories about Vecna's redemption arc are pretty insane. While Stranger Things is a bit too heavy on Henry Creel as the big bad to defeat, the prequel stage play on Broadway heavily implies that Henry's transformation into the evil, noseless Vecna stems from the Mind Flayer's corruption and influence. Since Henry is essentially a victim of a greater threat from the Upside Down, many people believe that he will actually help the gang defeat the Mind Flayer in the finale. In fact, they seem to think that Elle, Callie, Will, and the gang will team up to help Vecna break the curse that the Mind Flayer put on him. That is why he did not kill Will at the end. We know that Vecna was kidnapping all the 12 kids and having his demodogs drag them to the Upside Down because he wanted to trap them in his mindscape, make his a part of the Mind Flayer's hive mind, and then give them powers so they can become his soldiers in his grand world-dominating plans. right? But what if he wanted to give them powers to defeat the actual big bad of Stranger Things? Now, my theory is that the Mind Flayer already ordered Vecna to gather all these kids, so it can reshape the world, using Vecna as its mediator. But Vecna is using this to flip the script, which will become the show's main twist. Maybe Vecna is using the Mind Flayer's plan against him by giving powers to the kids and then using them to stop the entity from taking over the world. He knew that defeating the Mind Flayer isn't something he could do alone, and this is why he needed these kids. That's also why he didn't kill Will Byers, as he knew he would be an essential key in ending the Mind Flayer once and for all. Vecna is probably just doing enough to keep the Mind Flayer oblivious of how he plans to save the world, which means at the end, we might see Vecna, Holly, Derek, Will, Eleven, Callie, and the other kids, all coming together for the final showdown against the Mind Flayer's mega evil plan. However, there's another theory that is linked to what Vecna plans to do with the 12 kids. Apparently, Henry is willing to do so at any cost, even if it means sacrificing 12 kids to get there. And given that his character has always been obsessed with clocks, which has 12 hours in it, the theory is basically paralleling 12 kids with those 12 hours. This would somehow allow Henry to go back in time in order to meet the 8-year-old version of himself and stop that little boy from entering the Nevada cave system, so as to stop his life-altering meeting with the Mind Flayer after being zapped into Dimension X. If he actually ends up succeeding, all the tragedies that happened in Hawkins would end up never happening, because if he doesn't go over to Dimension X, Dr. Brenner would never be able to weaponize Henry to create other kids using his blood, nor would there be 11 or the open gates to the Upside Down. Another insane theory to paint Vecna in a sympathetic light mentions how, unlike Will, who was exposed to the real horrors of the Upside Down, Henry's mindscape essentially became a whimsical fairy tale paradise for Holly, giving her a sense of comfort that was really not needed on his part. Most shockingly, Henry gave Holly the boombox, even after it has been made clear that music actually protects his victims against Vecna, or the Mind Flayer, as it helps them to snap out of his mind grip. On top of that, he gave this gift to Holly in a mailbox, instead of handing it over to her. He could have just given it to her directly, unless he specifically wanted to draw her attention to the mailbox, hoping that she would think of looking through it. This is what she exactly did and ended up finding the note that Max left for her. Apparently, Henry could not seek out Max's help directly, or ask Holly to directly go to her, because the Mind Flayer can see into Henry's mind. So maybe he's just trying to make it seem like he is actually working with the Mind Flayer. But in reality, Henry knew this was his only chance to take the Mind Flayer down. Not just that. Some theories even mention how it is also possible that Henry Creel is trapped inside his own mindscape, and it's the essence of the Mind Flayer that is using Henry's body as a host. This has some credibility to it, because in Season 2, we saw how the Mind Flayer had embedded its essence within Will Byers, making him a perfect host. Ever since Will was flayed, he deliberately chose to stay cold because the Mind Flayer wanted him to, and he was also acting as a spy for the entity into the right side up. Up until El closed the gate, the rot from the Upside Down was spreading underneath Hawkins, and through Will's eyes, the Mind Flayer was giving instructions to the Hive Mind Army to start his mission to reshape the world, in his vision, because it's the Mind Flayer's nature to consider every other world as inferior compared to it. Now, we know that Joyce used heat to expel the shadowy entity out of Will, thus severing the direct link between the Mind Flayer and Will, whose body was the host. But Henry was never that lucky. Instead, Brenner pushed him to embrace the dark influence of the shadowy entity. So maybe after 11 banished Henry to the Upside Down, it's possible that the Mind Flayer began using him as the host body, thus rising to power as Vecna, while turning Henry Creel's mindscape into a fairy tale land, like mental prison, where the human part of his conscious mind remains trapped. This basically means Vecna is the Mind Flayer-possessed version of the villain, whereas the real Henry Creel might just be trapped inside his own mind. Anyway, that brings us to the very end of this video. What do you guys think about these theories? Are they really credible? Let us know about your thoughts and opinions in the comment box below.